Chapter 4. Extract from a letter received about 18 months after the early spring mentioned above. Now, as to this McCalmont business, in your place, I should certainly go no farther, or further. I never know which is right and which is wrong. There's no question of bringing the story to its logical conclusion, because there isn't one. Your theories and conjectures and the rest of it may be all right, and they may be all wrong. And just remember that for all we know, McCalmont may turn up any day, and that might be a nasty business for you. I remember Sandy McCalmont very well, and he always struck me as a man who would be extremely, shall we say, tenacious, if he got in a temper. I note what you say about your visit to a studio in the spring of last year. In the first place, as to the man himself, you say he struck you as very much changed, silent, morose, and apparently not in the least glad to see me. And I gather that the Lagavulin touch was conspicuous by its absence. I don't think there's much significance in that. There are genial Scotchmen and frozen Scotchmen, and sometimes, and naturally enough, you have samples of both temperaments in one man. And, as I've just said, he always struck me as having a reserve of grimness. One of his race gave me a most cordial invitation to dine with him at his club, and when the evening came, I was going to say he didn't speak a half-dozen words. That's a figure of speech, but, to be strictly accurate, if he had been measured up, I don't think his remarks all through the evening would have exceeded 100 words. He was all right the next time we met. Some of them are like that. You say that all the pictures you had seen when you went to the studio the autumn before had been cleared away, and that there was a new lot on the walls. The change you noticed is certainly interesting. The seduction of the elaborate landscapes into mere backgrounds, the trees barely indicated, the detail shadowy, and so forth. The twisted man promoted from a sort of super to be the real subject of the picture, a devilish figure, as you say, with, I gather, minor demons grouped about him, being instructed in strange traps and chases, in obscure employments, in pastimes that did not strike you as too agreeable. I was rather reminded of an old lacquer bureau I grew up with. I remember one of the drawers was decorated with the design of a golden garden of unearthly trees, in which Chinamen in golden robes tormented a porcupine with long wands of gold. All this was certainly very odd. You didn't like McCalmont's manner when he said, "You asked me for the story of the twisted man, and here it is." I don't see much in that, but that particular gesture in one of the pictures, the man pointing to an indistinct figure on the ground and lifting up his foot above it, well, still, as you can see for yourself, there's nothing you can fasten on in that. You can't charge a painter with the crimes he chooses to paint, and that's the fatal flaw in the whole of your case, if you think you have a case. Of course I remember that awful business of the poor girl in the July following. It was one of the most hideous and revolting things that have happened in my time, and I think that we should both agree that Fleet Street, with all its faults, rendered a public service by its suppression of most of the facts. I knew Selwyn of the Gazette, who was put on the country end of the story. He managed to see a sort of diary the girl had kept, about her visits to London and all that. I don't care to recall what he told me, but there again, when you try to put two and two together, you'll find it can't be done. There was nothing in those papers that Selwyn looked at to connect the unfortunate wretch with the studio. As you say, that square in Bloomsbury where the body was found is not a great distance off, but that's nothing to go on. And, after all, it seems to me that either way you would be well advised to let it alone. The man has gone away, and it seems likely that he will stay away, so there's no fear of any recurrence of these abominations. But, on the other hand, he may come back, and if he did, you might find yourself in the dock on a charge of criminal libel, and I don't think that such evidence as you have is anything like strong enough for you to put up a good defense. I say again, drop it. I took this advice so far as making any representations to the police was concerned. After some years, 9, getting on for 10, nothing has been heard of McCalmont. A cousin of his eventually received authority to deal with the pictures in the studio. Some of the earlier canvases appeared in due course in the dealers' shops round St. James and Bond Street, and others went to the auction rooms and realized very fair prices. There is a movement, I have gathered, in certain circles of art criticism to appreciate McAlmont's work very highly. One critic wrote lately, "It is an old school, if you like, but there is something there that the old school never had, and I don't think that any of us quite know what it is. And I am convinced that collectors, public and private, will do well to keep a very keen eye on McAlmont. At the present prices, they are undoubtedly bargains." And the studios are still asking where McAlmont got his model for the wonderful Twisted Man. There was one circumstance which I failed to mention when I consulted the friend who wrote me the letter of advice. I am not sure why I left it out of my story, possibly from a whimsical dislike of making the case too complete, possibly from a feeling, equally whimsical, that it was as well to keep one card, at least, safe and secret in my own hand. But 2 nights after the discovery of the package in Irving Square, when the horror was still black and raging, I felt that I must visit that secret studio on the hillside. It was a clear night with the red moon, just past the full, rising out of a low band of clouds, and this time I found my way without any difficulty, and just as I came down the flight of steps that led into the open square, I saw the green door of McAlmont's studio open. Very cautiously at first, inch by inch, and then wider, and a figure, vague against the darkness behind it, seemed to peer about for a moment. Then the door was opened wide, and as quickly shut, and I saw a man, all twisted and bent so as to be dwarf-like, go capering with fantastic and extravagant gestures across the scene of light, and vanish into a narrow passage which led down the hill between garden walls and the shadowy boughs of trees. I stood still, beaten back into the shelter of my steps, drawing a long breath. I had recognized very well that dancing and terrible figure, and I was quite overcome by the utter impossibility of that which I had certainly seen. I had been living for some time with gathering suspicions of some dreadful and mysterious connection between the work of the studio and the horror of the waste place in Westminster, but they had been vague surmises and unshapen fears. But this was delirium, nightmare walking visibly abroad. I shook myself out of my terror and went briskly up to the studio door and rang the bell. The door was opened by McAlmont's handyman, whom I had seen pottering about on my last visit. I asked him if Mr. McAlmont were at home. "Not at the moment, sir," he replied, "but please to step in. Mr. McAlmont told me he'd be back in a minute. He's only gone to post a letter, and I'm sure he'd be very sorry to miss you." I followed the man to the studio, which was all lit up. I stood there in a great bewilderment. "But, William," I said, "I saw somebody come out by that door just as I was coming down the steps, but it was a twisted sort of man, like that man in all of Mr. McAlmont's pictures. I thought it must be the model." The notion had flashed into my mind at that moment, as with a deep sigh of relief. William looked puzzled. "It must have been Mr. McAlmont, sir. There's nobody else been here tonight. He went out a couple of minutes ago. But the man I saw was twisted, crooked, and he was dancing about like a lunatic." "Then, sir, I think that was Mr. McAlmont all right. I expect he was doing what he calls his physical jerks, thinking there would be nobody about to see him. He says it's strongly recommended by the doctors. But do be seated, sir, if you please." I was staring at a great sheet of paper on an easel. It was covered with black charcoal outlines, to me significant and most awful. I had heard something of the contents of the package that had been found under the bushes of Irving Square. I told the man I really could not wait. I hurried out of the place and struck away up to the north, and made as quickly as I could for the broad and jangling streets, and so got home at last, avoiding dark narrows and short-cuts all the way. I do not know how long William waited for his master to return, but he waited vainly.